Myles Bryan, pursuing joy through authentic experiences. Extremely excited to have you here today. I got a preview of the presentation. I'm very, very excited for this, for the conversation to follow. So with that, I will take up no more airspace and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, let me just jump in. And I tried to be good and make proper speaker notes for once. So let me just pull those up. So I have a lot to say, and I was lamenting earlier. I was like, this is one of those things that you can just easily get so off topic because this is very, very much like the most personal conversation I think I've led so far. For any of you who've seen my talks previously, you'll know that I've kind of skewed into like the AI and creative technology space, but um, in sort of light of the world and I don't know, without getting so deep into it, the things that I think are impacting all of our lives in different ways. I've been struggling, and I wanted to try to lead, through those struggles, maybe a productive conversation on how I think we can sort of overcome those challenges through the way I describe authentic experiences. And so, my name is Myles Bryan. I am a creative director and managing director at Hyperquake, but I am also a storyteller with roots in a shared field that I think we can all relate to, or many of us can. I love what I do, in a time especially such as now. Like I think I find a lot of solace in what I do and the people I do it with. Um, Part of my roles, just to give a little bit deeper of a background before we get into the meat of the conversation, is my creative leadership as a creative director. I'm very focused on leading projects within the experiential spectrum, and that includes everything from animated media to interactive creative technology, visual design, film, really whatever purposes they need to serve for the clients. We're in an intent-led team, which is to say that we don't really prescribe any sort of one method to and output. We always try to prescribe the right response to any given situation. But my methodology and how I lead those teams is largely through my management practice. Um, I will frequently sort of liken myself to a really bad executive producer because I am a bad producer. I'm probably a better creative, but I am a good creative in that I work with the capabilities of much better teams and stronger individuals that exist around me that help me produce that work, and I'm really proud of those. And then that leads me sort of to my Rolodex, the people in the network that I work with. Is something that I include as a skill because I'm immensely proud of those individuals, and the fact that I have them and we're all pleased to work together is something that keeps me going. I have a lot of work, and some of this work will sort of loosely span just a little bit of previous studios, although I'll mostly be talking about my work at Potion, part of Hyperquake. Um, but that I think I'm very much inspired by the opportunities that have come before that, and such as my time at local projects, the studio I co-founded with my partner Cynthia, who's also on this call, as well, and sort of how that work has led me to where I am, and then also where I think it's going to take me. But for those who are a little less familiar with what I do in the experiential world, that's just kind of a bad umbrella term that many of us, pull because we don't always know how to describe the sort of creative and technological nuances in the work that we create. Which is to say that we do tend to work in a lot of physical environments. We think a lot about humans engage with those environments beyond just your typical architectural and interior design practices. We work a lot on screens and media surfaces and use cool technologies like wireless sensors and motion detection, AI to form deeper connections with people who visit our publications and our environments and the creatives that we make. And sometimes it can be as simple as visual design and environmental graphics, and sometimes it can be as immensely complex and immersive as things like the Dream Cube that you see on the bottom right. All of these being projects, of course, that I worked with really amazing teams and large people. But my role has typically been focusing on things that move in immersive content. To speak a little bit about my background and just sort of how I got through that process and to where I am now, I started out as a motion designer, arguably an okay one. It was enough to be gainfully employed by various studios, many of which are here, have worked with me in different capacities. But it was probably only like 2 or 3 years as working as a motion designer that I realized it wasn't really, my passion. I really sort of used that as a mechanism to get me more into more technical pipelines and integrating like pixel perfect creative technology into what order sort of led me into a passion for real time environments which, up until getting into some of my latter parts of my career, which are definitely more relevant to what I do now. Things like motion director, again, kind of like a complex media producer, into experiential design director, where I sort of moved over into more holistic design across the whole craft, into what I would say I do now. I think it's still most effective to refer to myself as a creative director. But like I said, very much a team driven creative. I'm only ever as strong as my weakest member, and I strive to keep everybody moving together. What's next? I don't know. I find that the industry moves me as much, or much more so than I move the industry. I would say. I think that's probably a better way to put it. Um, but in a time where I find that I feel personally at conflict with who I am and the work that I do and kind of everything around me, maybe something people here can relate to. I'm always thinking about how I can move or shake or introduce a little chaos or controlled chaos into a circumstance to, shake myself up and deconstruct a little bit and try something new. And regardless of where I'm at or who I'm doing that with, I just love the opportunities that come from that, and I'm really excited, despite how I feel about certain aspects of the world and circumstances. I'm still excited for what comes next and the opportunities that come with that. And so, I think now we can get into what we're here to talk about, um, which is very much joy through the lens of authentic experiences. In a world where we as creatives are now inundated with the expectations of creating very flashy media, how do we create meaningful moments that matter? How do we remain invigorated to push cutting edge work without compromising that content just by way of making it pretty? To me, it begins and ends with lived experiences. I think back to my time as a child. I lived a privileged childhood. I was very well loved and very well taken care of. Um, and that's not a circumstance that everyone shares. But for me, that was a time where I felt the world was a little bit simpler and joy was easy to access. And I think looking back, it's easy for me to recall how simple that joy was to access because the experiences around me were so light and so easy to engage with. I grew up on a farm in Southwest Georgia with very little access to technology. My mother was actually the person who taught me how to code and introduced me to my first 3D software at the age of like 11, which is an interesting little tidbit. This was at a time where not a lot of people in small town rural Georgia like had good computers or even fast internet. So I was very fortunate to have that kind of introduction to the field in a way, and it's still a big part of what drove me to do what I do now. Although I would say as the world became more complex through my greater sort of mind expansion and understanding of the complexities of the world and subsequent deep depression that followed that, that joy also became harder to access. So I found this sort of interest to touch back on this as someone who has grown. Um, Joy has become more difficult for me to reach because of the way I have filled my mind and the way that I have begun to engage with the world and society and the people that I care about. And now it feels like this sort of balancing act that um, has become more difficult to manage. And it's only through deconstructing myself and sort of tearing at the seams a little bit and breaking apart the armors that I've created around myself that I've begun to sort of reach back deeply into that original joy and sort of undo a little bit of what I felt like was protecting myself, which in fact was maybe actually restricting me access from that joy. So the two people on screen in front of you are in fact the same person. It may not be a surprise to most of you here that I am a trans woman. And that is not something that I've known for my entire life, but it is something that I've felt for the vast majority of it as being sort of, or rather to say, like what I have felt for the majority of my life was something that was very incorrect. And having lived over 32 years before my transition, being told and sort of pushed into a box and sort of being told to act and exist as a certain way, trying to force myself to live as that thing despite feeling so wrong about it. What I also realized, especially more so now, is that I was limiting the potential of my own happiness, and I was also limiting the like access to the creative I had within myself because I was literally I was literally stopping myself from, existing in the most fully authentic way, the most true to myself way, and essentially, I guess my thesis in this conversation for myself and everybody is, um, the more you can align yourself with, what you feel is that true and most authentic version of yourself, the better you'll actually be at your work because you're not limiting yourself by this physical restriction or this mental and psychological restriction. You are really allowing yourself to be challenged at the fullest extent, um, and make incredible things because of it, because you're no longer kind of getting in your own way. Um, and what I want to speak about is the excitement that can come with how that light outweighs the darkness and what we do as experiential creatives. Because it certainly manifests in what we do. I think, and this is something I feel very strongly about, craft and skill will get you far, but they won't get you everywhere. A technician can press a button, but I think we as creatives are really called um, to work with people, to work with humans, to make things, especially in the technological space, that may feel unrelatable or even scary for different audiences, and understand those things in a different way and present them in different ways. And so, if we're not really understanding ourselves or really aligning ourselves to our truest values, then it's going to be difficult to appreciate the nuances of the tools that we're working with, if we can't see past ourselves. And so for me, I think the ability to work past this depression, which I think used to fuel a lot of my creativity. There's sort of this stereotype of like the sad artists, and like they kind of always make interesting things, but I would argue that that's because they're tapping into this sort of vulnerability, and exposure that creates an openness to, I think, that same creativity and input. And so being able to lean into that vulnerability has made me a better creative, through this enhanced empathy and listening, which has made me better able and available to work with the teams I have. And this has led to an extensive portfolio of experiential work across a strong variety of intentions. And so, again, I'm not going to linger too long on previous projects, but these were some of the ones I was showing before, that I think are still incredible to look back on, although I don't know if some of these even exist anymore. This was launched at the earliest days of the COVID pandemic, worked on with an incredible team at local projects, and had many facets between, the spectrum of exhibit design, media, and everything you see, to this like really cool 3D cube on the bottom right, where we're using like OptiTrack and projection to track a living soccer ball. And I wasn't terribly good at that. But I think these three projects that I was going to show are actually sort of representing a triangle, of intentions, to speak back to an earlier point that I was getting into, which is, there's a lot of different ways to tap into vulnerability and things that are uncomfortable to drive really joyful, crazy, cool, interactive, environments that we work in. And for me, I mean, my lack of interest in sports, was really interesting in this project because it actually, I think, drove me to, again, sort of deconstruct myself and get out of my own head and think about, like, why are these sports interesting for people and why do they care so much about Manchester United, just one of many European football teams, of which I know very little about. I think the extent of my soccer knowledge is like every 4 years, when one of the rotating World Cups happens. So, that to me, it was hard to relate to the subject matter, but it wasn't hard for me to relate to the experience. The people who do care about this, care passionately about the team members and the stories behind those team members and sort of the rise, from trauma that team went through, and how that's later translated into these historic wins and incredible, European football moments that are so exciting for people. And that was enough to get me excited. It was that empathy and that shared connection into what was driving the audiences that I was working with that made me very passionate about working on this project, with the team that I worked on. And so while I'm not terribly good at soccer, I could allow myself to get immersed in that feeling, so that while I was on this pitch and I was working, or the literal pitch, not the original pitch, like the soccer pitch is a term that I learned. Doing that, I was able to sort of get my head in that framework and make something, I think, with the team that was really really interesting, and very interactive. Of course, I mean, we were sweating like crazy working on this thing, leading into maybe a softer experience, which, I mean, this is going to hit everybody like completely differently. depending on your historical understanding, your religious values, all of that coming together for the Faith and Liberty Discovery Center, a project that a very incredible team and I worked on at local projects in Philadelphia, which was filled with some of the most interesting interactives that I've ever worked on. Everything from RFID like collection to detection, and the use of this sort of central wand device that people could carry through that would light up different spaces, record different spaces, become a very one-to-one interactive paradigm and things like the large immersive theater, and also reveal things that you were collecting throughout the space. The interesting thing about that project was how controversial it was. It doesn't take a lot of um, it doesn't take a lot to understand why anybody and everybody might have differing opinions and values on a religious institution or working with a religious institution, and then tying that to any kind of framework of history or the signing of the Constitution and the founding of our country. But what's interesting about that is how you can inject your own sense and understanding of that value into the creative process to drive a more equal, I would say, outcome. And I think that's what we were really effectively able to do. Again, this sort of use of empathy to be heard, and by way of being heard, introduce more volume into the conversation and subject matter that you're speaking into, which I think makes it more relatable as a whole, and allows people the opportunity to make conform their own opinions, and still enjoy the craft and creations that you're working in. But sometimes stuff just has to be pretty, and we've also had the opportunity of making very pretty things. I'm very pleased with the work that I've been able to do with my partner Cynthia, my wife, in this meeting, and we've had the chance to bridge a lot of our creative and shared talents with our team across the world, just to make things that were freaking cool. And that energy that they generated was exciting enough to get people motivated and excited, and I would definitely say joyful, because they were part of a community and a network that was loud and verbose, and they were all excited to be in it, and we were excited to be a part of it. So, reeling back for just a moment, how do we stop the doom spiral? Again, like, this is for me easily one of the more personal conversations ever. It's hard as a trans person in the world right now to not feel like many marginalized communities that things are just not that fun. And maybe these things don't directly affect everybody here, but I'm sure we all have neighbors and allies and friends that we do care about that are impacted by a lot of the negativity existing around us right now. And maybe that's not really a new thing. And I would say on some level, everybody is impacted by that same kind of rhetoric and sentiment in various ways. But I do feel an elevated sense of it. And maybe that's just because of the personal aspects. But a friend of mine and I were also talking yesterday about just how that sort of shared and elevated stress finds its way into the community and sort of brings us all down regardless of its impact on us directly. And so that's really what we have to think about, is each other and how we advocate for our friends, allies, and neighbors in the work that we do. My work in the culture space is always meant to be creating opportunities to take anything from the dense histories, cultures, studies of anthropology, and shape them into shared points of human understanding, such as working on projects for the Interactive Constitution and the National Constitution Center. It felt particularly relevant to share this project first. This is an older potion project that a very different team worked on at the time. But this one focused on the 14th Amendment, and it was, I think, very well executed, beautifully designed, but more importantly, made accessible the knowledge of the 14th Amendment and its applications in citizenship, equal protection, due process, voting rights, and enforcement, which all seem to be a little bit under attack at the moment. So might be a good time to go visit the National Constitution Center or encourage your friends and family to do so. All the way to the National Museum of the American Latino at the Smithsonian. This was a really fun project that I had the opportunity to work on almost at the start of my tenure at Potion, which is just speaking into more representation of our friends, families, and neighbors in the southern border and their shared experiences with having family here, living there, feelings of acceptance and complexities across the history of the shifting borders of North America, and how Mexico has changed over time, and what that has meant for their language and their connections to their families, their citizenship, and how that has impacted them as a whole. I think what's exciting about this project was not only was that language and those stories, treated very equally and presented, I think, in a very, very fun way, but it was also easily the most accessible experience we've ever worked on. Dual language, fully, the controllers, it had everything. It had built smart Unity environments that would shift and change their scale based on different degrees of mobility and variability and all of the above. So I think this project sort of became an excellent standard on media excellence, but then also availability to a lot of different kinds of audiences. To again, another project that I was very pleased to work on, the Explore Asia project at the Asia Society Texas Center in, forget, Houston or Austin, Texas. I'm not really geographically inclined on Texas, but one of those two. That focus on bringing the culture from our neighbors far and wide, especially across Asia and the many regions within Asia as a whole, getting beyond just sort of the maybe most commonly known areas, and speaking to what may feel different at first glance are actually different lived global societies and social experiences that are more relatable than they are different. It is simply the way that those communities sort of perceive and input their cultures into the very same experiences that we live over here that sort of shape the lenses that make them different. And so this project was really exciting. Use of media, fashion, travel, music, and food, and all of the above to sort of represent those many cultures and these very fun and just sort of simple to engage with, family-friendly interactives, to really like highlight those differences and put everybody on equal footing to really encourage an open dialogue. We need to encourage each other by also not just looking outward, but also looking inward. I think my use of the craft has always been to sort of, again, like focus on what I refer to as a deconstructed mindset. Again, the sort of looking inward, but how can we actually help people look at the work that we create from many different perspectives, whether it's our perspective, the original artist perspective, their own perspectives, or from an educational perspective, and learn things that they would not have otherwise known. This was very true for the work we did with the Cleveland Museum of Art on ArtLens, which was everything from multi-sensor, multi-mobility, also a lot of great accessibility, 16 custom games that help people look at artwork different ways, move artwork that they couldn't otherwise touch because of its sensitivity. That was later, we were able to sort of translate that into a digital environment and make it very high definition, and actually allow them to perceive art and experience art in a way they would not have otherwise been able to do, because of how we were able to capture that content and recontextualize it in the digital environment, with the sort of sole execution drive to the brief there being encourage people to spend more time looking at art. And that was it. And I think we were very successful in doing so. To sort of take another approach to a similar brief, our work with the M+ Museum in Hong Kong was very different. Rather than just simply asking people to spend more time looking at art, we wanted them to input and project their own thoughts on it. So we would show them the artworks as we would present on this sort of robotic arm. They could bring out an artwork, but also sort of bring out a projection surface. We created a digital canvas for that. It was linked to these tablets, as you can see sort of laying out here. But the prompt on this project was to encourage people to look at the art and simply respond to it with having basically no information otherwise. What do they think they see? And what was so interesting about this, especially being a bilingual, bicultural project between English and Chinese, were the kinds of responses that people would give, whether or not they were a woman or a man or from this country or that country. They would look at it and they all would feel something different from the artworks they would look at, and then they would see that aggregated on the board, and sort of be encouraged to communicate and speak about it based on what they saw. And so it was very much an aggregator that sort of presented that work back to them in a way that I think was really, really cool. I'm going to move a little bit faster, but I mean, I think this also applies to some of our work in science museums between the Frost Museum of Science and the Chicago Science Institute. Um, just very, I think this project I selected in particular because of how it actually brought youth and young people into the environment, an audience in particular I like to work with because of their sort of natural curiosity. And this was a project whose brief was to help young people of all different kinds of backgrounds, regardless of their social setting or financial circumstances, and be able to see themselves in roles that actually had a lasting impact on their communities in every level, whether it was low energy management or global energy management. And I think it is sort of that shared experience and our ability to project, very literally in this case, into a space and invite that kind of conversation even at the youngest level, that allows these kids to come in and actually see themselves as future energy specialists. Not a route that I went down myself, but you never know. So I actually thought I was going to get through this like way faster. So I guess we're doing fine. But anyway, we share joy where it is hardest to find. And so these are a few hospital projects, particularly children's hospital projects that our team at Potion have had the privilege to work on. And I think these are all particularly interesting because catharsis is a common theme among all of them, distraction on some level, especially with understanding how kids feel and sort of experience an environment that might be sort of scary, cold, and clean, like a hospital. Um, but the way that catharsis was translated over all of these projects was translated very differently from a lobby space where people might be waiting anxiously, pushing them into this more active environment to hopefully be distracted from the anxiety they were likely feeling, to something much more calm and collected, such as our work with the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where um, there's not really a great way to spin it. It's a bad place to be. And so we want to be conscious of that and really just put something in front of you that allows you to project your thoughts in a different and hopefully lighter way. And I don't normally show unproduced projects, but on the subject, this was a project that we had started to work on previously, but didn't actually see to fruition. But I really love the sketches and sort of the creative output that our team had started on this project before it was halted. But this would have been sort of a threshold that we were working on that was sort of meant to be a combination of a lot of the work that I was describing earlier. Various degrees of excitement, but calming and very thoughtful use of sensory, knowing the different kinds of kids that would be passing through that environment, to create something that was really sort of thoughtful and beautiful. So as we're sort of beginning to wrap up, I have just a few slides that do sort of touch very lightly on what is exciting to me, that will have the occasional use of the AI word. But when it comes to like how we're beginning to understand each other, especially in a time when fewer conversations are being had and disinformation is spreading widely, and I feel like we're all sort of being torn apart from each other, I actually see AI as a tool for empathy, and these kinds of advanced networkings as even greater tools for empathy because they allow us to communicate with each other in ways that were much more difficult to do before. You'll see and hear a common theme in my talks pretty regularly, which is sort of this idea of deconstruction. How can we sort of get out of our own heads, project our thoughts outward, and help those thoughts be interpreted in such a way that more people will understand, or have thoughts be conveyed over to us that will feel more relatable to us as we pass through those spaces. And I very much see AI as a means of achieving that result if done right, which means challenging ourselves to face the unknowns, to be uncomfortable, to learn how to exist comfortably in uncomfortable environments. And despite all the terrible things that can be achieved with misinformation, AI, and these advances in that technology, we as creatives are really the ones who are meant to take up the mantle in shaping that work to be inviting and inclusive for audiences. So by allowing purpose within our spaces to take its own voice, we create a deeper relationship with our visitors. And I mean that somewhat literally in my mind when I think of how we're using AI in the environments that we're working with. I mean to give that space a voice, to take whatever content, messaging, every project that I've shown you thus far and construct that into a voice that can function through different screens, audible formats, music, however, to reach audiences on a personalized and individual level as they go through those spaces, which requires a degree of engagement. Being genuine in our curiosity and paying attention to different communities and different people's needs to understand their needs. Sorry, I think someone's knocking on my door, and I'm just going to ignore it. I'm in a hotel. I don't know why they would do that. Uh, to jump ahead, paying attention, absorbing people's needs, and then sort of constructing that and interpreting that in a way that can be translated back into those communities by listening, deconstructing our generalized understanding of our audiences and acknowledging where we're failing to serve them already. I mean, I think this would be true in any project. You can only really like reach so many people because you're going to try to average your content in most sort of historical ways to reach the widest possible audience. You're going to want to make it feel, in some cases, less controversial because you're trying to speak to more, or you lean into its controversy because you want that shock value, or you know, really the sort of emotional impact of that content to hit. I see sort of the advances in communicative sharing as a means of achieving both. If you know people's openness and you're able to sort of respond to people's sort of expressed desires and how they want to engage with the space, depending on their own accessibility, sensorial levels, or environmental considerations, you can actually tailor the degree of that content for different audiences. Interestingly, I've been criticized for this viewpoint in some levels as sort of washing that content. That is very much not my intention when I express this. I think in the case of a Holocaust museum, that content in a way will sort of speak for itself. What is important to me is that it is communicated most effectively and correctly to the different audiences that come in, because everybody is going to have, based on their own backgrounds, a different way of perceiving that information. And so if anything, what I am trying to protect the most is the intent and the way that that information is shared, which lets us respond to those audiences in a way that is most effective. When the future seems less secure, find joy in the shared experience and seek new ways to connect with each other or build them. And I think that really is our job as creatives. If there again is a theme to what I've shared today, deconstructivism is a big part of that, leaning into not necessarily your skills and experience as a craftsperson, but your skills and experience as a living person, and how the people around you have shaped those experiences, how you have found joy in the moments that matter the most, and how you can work with the people around you to better understand the things that are scary, bring yourself out of your own biases, and make things that are really beautiful and impactful for the widest possible audience. And where do I find joy? That is exactly in what I just described, with the people, teams, family, friends and allies, dogs that exist in my universe. These are all people that I've had the privilege of working or existing around. And obviously from the group I see in the audience now, that is much wider than is expressed here, but this is why I do what I do. And I do the work I do for you and everybody I've shown here. So thank you.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Miles. That was really, really great. Um, anybody, I have so many questions myself, but if you have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, or do put yourself on camera and raise your hand, and I will allow you to ask yourself, or I can ask for you. But Miles, one of the things I actually kind of wanted to jump onto was, we've both been kind of like very engaged in the museum space, and like, or just like even this idea of like the experience design space, people in physical spaces together. Like what is it about that attracts you? Why is I know why it attracts me, but like what is it about that you find gratifying?
That's a great question. So I used to, when I thought I wanted to be a motion designer, I was sort of obsessed with movement in general. So I mean, it seemed like a natural fit to go into something animation related. Um, but what I wasn't actually interested in was making pixels move on a screen. I was more interested in how we perceived the things that were moving on the screens. I was more interested in how people engaged with things that were moving around them. And so there was sort of this animation aspect that was really sort of core to my journey into the built environment and these types of spaces that I work in. And, I don't think there's anything static about most of my work. I've never been terribly good at graphic design. I've always been great at digital content. And so I think there is a sort of need to inject motion into any situation. And I always just sort of saw interactivity and the use of sensors and these sort of additional layers of augmented knowledge as ways of making things more animated and therefore animating people and moving people through the spaces. And so it's very much a pixel to person kind of translation.
Yeah, there's also something very gratifying I found about like seeing people interact with your work in that way. It's like a very it's an interesting canvas to operate in. Um, I have other questions as well. So like the other thing I want to think about is like, like sort of like empathy in spaces. And how do we think about, how do we think about the audience that are going to be interacting in these spaces and sort of engaging with the content in these spaces. But then how do you how do you kind of like not over program, or like, or like over direct those audiences to your endpoints. I know that like sort of ties in a little bit of how you've been thinking about AI. I don't know if this is like a totally muddled question. But I guess the question is like, how do you create empathetic experiences for your visitor?
To me, the answer to that has to be, kind of what I said earlier, which is getting out of our own ways. Like, I think, and this is tough, for people who run businesses. I know you understand this well. Like, you have to generate profit. You have to sort of structure things in a way that they can be profitable. But I always feel like the most successful projects are where you just sort of dial in on that intention really quickly, and you understand exactly, what the client's interests are, what the people you're working with, what they're trying to get out of it. And the more you can focus on that rather than trying to inject like a service or, it's got to have a CMS or it's got to use this, API that we built, or it's got to have this, it's got to use Unity and not Unreal. Like these become things that sort of stack and stack and stack. And I think they actually can be very limiting in that creative process. And they sort of get in our way. So the less prescriptive we can be without overburdening ourselves with constantly trying to make things bespoke, there's like a balance to be struck. But I kind of lost my way a little bit on that, but I think it's somewhere in there.
Also, great. Brad, you had a question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Miles. This is a great talk. I love this provocation of joy. Um, I won't read word for word my chat because it's wordy, but basically, a lot of the spaces you're already working in are kind of, I think, kind of primed and receptive to authenticity and playfulness and joy. As a provocateur, what space would you want to go into to sort of like challenge yourself in these ideas? And it doesn't, I'm not being overtly political or anything like that. I mean, I'm just curious, like what challenge would excite you that you would kind of test these ideas in?
I don't know if I have a great answer for. I mean, like I'm one thing I learned from the visual effects space, working on like some title sequences and a lot of commercial projects were just like how interesting the output of a good video or like even some of my work in the branded environments were based on like again like storytelling. And the better you could sort of understand the brand or you could better understand the story and the output of what you were trying to say and create, like it was always effective. And so I don't think there's like a one-to-one equation to the brand space and the culture space or these other kinds of environments. But I do always feel like the more you can bring it back to the storytelling of any of those, and certainly anything could have a story to tell, then I would be equally excited to work on all of them. Well, with obvious caveats. I think there's definitely a few that I avoid, but I'm always sort of intrigued by even luxury brands and sort of the obsessions of people who get so into the consumerist aspects of like buying these products and what becomes like kind of a network and this really intimate experience with those communities. Like they're very sort of viciously into the brands that they support, and it's like almost religious in a way. And so I'm very curious about that more than I am sort of the act of working on those projects. But I think there is something at the center of all of them that sort of links back to the way you can understand the communities and why they're so sort of driven, that it does excite me.
Cool. Thank you.
I'll jump in again. One of the things that's sort of interesting is, design. Like particularly the kind of design that we do, like it's somewhat personal, but it's also like this, you're kind of in the service industry too. Like you're serving a client, but then you're also trying to express yourself. And like that's a really like that can be like really challenging. I'm just curious, how have you had to like negotiate that in the past or in some of these projects?
I'm so sorry, Josh. I saw Christopher's question come
Oh,
through
no
first.
worries, no worries. Do you want to jump on do you want to jump on that one?
I got so just well, I mean, that was a bit of a mic drop of a response, so it just like kind of captured me for a minute as soon as you started speaking.
Oh yeah, yeah, go for it, go for it. Well,
Well,
I think yeah. Do you want to jump in on this one, Christopher? Do you want to ask, or should we have this conversation?
Which Christopher?
Stapleton.
Stapleton.
Oh, yeah, that's me. Okay,
It's
which
you.
one are you talking about?
Oh no, you were saying the Holocaust does not speak for itself, and I think that was a statement, something that sort of
Yeah.
Myles had said. But yeah, what should we tease out there?
Well, working with the Holocaust Museum, there was an issue about story itself being so ending with a tight little bow of conclusion and catharsis when in actuality it's an open wound. And your concept of provocation of joy, I worked with them looking at children's toys that were made by their parents in concentration camps, where the making of the toy for the child was a way for the child to have an act of resistance through play. And I put a link in there on a talk I did for AWE in looking at that and how to do that, because the story of the Holocaust is always focusing on the wrong end of the Holocaust. And through children's diaries is a very powerful way, hundreds of them beyond Anne Frank, that pulls this beauty of innocence in the face of atrocity that really kind of warms the heart really and tells the real lesson of of how do we of the Holocaust.
Yeah,
But
well, I
I
mean,
was wondering if you were did you do some work with the Holocaust and add the provocation of joy?
actually,
I think it's
personally,
a
no,
great
not in that instance. There's more than a few Holocaust museums out there that I think do accomplish that way more effectively. But when I was actually responding something when I said that out loud to something that someone had said to me in a previous talk. They were like, you can't take these tools and watch something as immense as the Holocaust because people need to experience the weight of that. And I couldn't disagree with that statement. But then I also think, and this was sort of my point at the time as well, like relatability is what's important. And the story that you're describing, by sort of focusing on this lens that was relatable and even had like a tinge of beauty to it that people could look into and see how
yeah.
real that was and how it could tie so closely to something so terrible is what was like a bridge to help people, I think, understand the gravity of that reality, that thing that very much happened, despite what some people seem to want to say about it. Um, and I think that's what I really try to dial into is like, is there a way to be really thoughtful and tailor those little like bridge points to different kinds of audiences so that they can have that equal level of access to that intention, to that internalization of that story.
Right. And working with the children of the Holocaust in that project, there was a lot of hot buttons, and one was you don't simulate history to learn from history, which is not true in other kind of applications. But it is a powerful, yeah, you have to find that inner lesson to learn. And it was just there are thousands of Holocaust museums around there, and we've turned a lot of that into cliches of the Holocaust and not the true meaning and lesson. And I think your work could really add a really powerful depth to that.
No, it's interesting that I haven't, despite how many of them there are, I would love the opportunity to actually work one-on-one because that should be a story that everybody should get, and yet it's still for some reason not. But if anything, it should be like an easy one to understand. But I liked your comment, and that's sort of why I fixated on it when you posted in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because I feel like in some ways like this whole field of experience design. I think this is one of the reasons I do future spaces is like kind of it's a medium, and like there's like probably not one way to do a Holocaust museum in the same way there's like not one way to do like a Holocaust movie, and like but it's a medium that I don't think is as well sort of like documented or shared about as some other mediums. like at least that's been my perception of it. I don't know, Miles, like how like yeah, how has your sort of craft evolved over the years?
I think, well, I mean, certainly I've gotten better. I mean, I used to joke that I wasn't a terribly good designer. So I mean, I think there was like a little bit of a skill issue early on where
Yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing. I like shifted into motion design after getting like an English degree
Oh,
because
I got
like
one of those.
I love, yeah, it's funny how much of us do. Like it's interesting, but I was like, I really enjoyed writing. I like storytelling. It was really important to try to always have this kind of deeper narrative, regardless of what I was doing. And the problem was, is like I kept trying to translate that over into animation, and it was like I way overcomplicated everything I did, like just all the time. I just couldn't get out of my own like head about it. Um, and so it was sort of getting out into the world and actually really becoming excited by professionalism. Like I actually enjoy the career aspect of design because it has always given me like goals and objectives and briefs that have helped me like really focus
Yeah,
and
yeah,
try
yeah.
to dial in on an intention. Um,
Yeah.
it's funny because I don't hear that repeated very often, but it's actually like that was a big thing for me. It was like being a paid designer and learning how to like really focus on the goals and like even to like a management level, like financially, like understanding what all the tools were and like what the end result was supposed to achieve became way more important than like whatever thing I had in my mind or whatever like crazy visual I thought I wanted to do. Like, I could kind of get out of my own head a little bit and focus on that and also grow by way of working with better people. So,
I love it. Chloe, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking this is rolling around in my head a little bit in regards to client work and the kinds of projects we do. I think oftentimes the sort of iterative design and the joy that you're integrating almost like I read that as coming from limitation to some extent, given what you proposed in the beginning and also just the reality of client work. We have input and a certain degree of drive, but that's the collaborative aspect is how do we integrate towards a shared vision? And so I guess my question is, do you think that creating something without limitation would actually be joyful and that joy would be easy to bring along with you? Or do you feel like to some extent folding in these other narratives is kind of key to that process?
that's a really it's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I think to me, like there's this I almost built this talk a little bit more around just like the sort of rise of technology and this kind of need to integrate all these cool things into the work we do. Um, but how that's always kind of been the case. But one point I really do believe in is like the success of any work that we create is always driven back to the story. And so, the technology and the tools to the craft like don't really mean anything if you're still not delivering a profound message. And so, this sort of idea of like an endless, like immensely cool input environment where just like anything is sort of play and possible that I think would be exciting. In a lot of ways could also just as well be, a total sensory overload. And so, I think, and glad you spoke because I think some about our previous conversations, like what I'm really exciting is maybe thinking about how these tools can be used to reimagine mediums that have probably felt common or overused in other ways or saturated and use them differently. You as a sound designer, I mean, for me, I think sound is definitely one of those environments that I think about quite a lot, especially as it pertains to the AI space, because there's so much we can do now with like creating new kinds of compositions and kind of breaking formulas that we're used to. And I'm more curious about that. So I don't actually think I have a great answer to your question, but I do think, what I would say is like, rather than focusing on like this endless result, I'm more interested in sort of breaking the conventions that we're most familiar with, because I think we have tools that'll help do that.
So Miles, going to talk a little bit about AI. I
Let's
know
do it.
No. I guess because Miles gave a presentation at SCGX Lab, which I was not there for, about AI. But apparently there was like some pushback in the community on on your embrace of AI, and I've been kind of very bullish about AI. But like, what is it there that you're really excited about, or like what's really interesting there, and like what do you think's threatening to people about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the marketing of it is really threatening for people. I feel like many things, it kind of feels like it's being shoved down everybody's throats and it's AI and everything. And so to be one more voice that's like touting its value is probably not doing me any service. And that X Lab conversation was really interesting because like I keep asking people to give me hard advice or like hard questions without necessarily expecting them to do it, and then they do it, and I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Okay. No, but I think to me, like AI, and I had an opportunity with a previous client to work on like actual sort of modeling projects, and applying to like a professional B2B use case all the way back in 2016 for like a few years. And it's a name that everybody would be familiar with, but they were sort of, it was expensive and there were so many data scientists involved, and it wasn't really at a place where it had like opened up and gotten so much community input and grown to a place where it was like kind of tangible and more digestible to the the everyday person. And even back then, I mean, we had to learn just so much about like designing interfaces around that animated content we were working with, which meant kind of understanding like how the models were trained and how it all worked, because we had to tell a story around it. Um, and when I realized, I was just like, oh my god, like if we could take any of this work and apply it toward any kind of real time use case, like people would get it. This would be so fun. And like it just sort of happened that now we can like these tools have opened up and everybody's just sort of sharing their information and nothing is behind a black box. And like, and of course you see it being used for really terrible use cases, but like if we know what we're doing, we also know how to use it for incredible use cases. I mean, and I think maybe the thing that's getting in our way with it is us, because we only really think of AI as sort of this like crude reflection of human communication. But it's not a person, and I think that's actually what makes it so great, is it actually handles unstructured information differently than people do, and we can throw things at it in a way that we think we understand. Oh, I like that augmented
Mental
imagination.
matches.
Chris, if I can just steal that, no,
Yeah.
I'll make sure you're credited. Yeah, I like that because it is that. It's like it is just another. It is really another way of processing really complex information, that is sort of getting out of our own heads. And like if I just spend an hour talking about getting out of my own head, I think of AI as a really great tool for doing that.
Yeah. Let's see, I don't know if that's a question. Yeah, no, I do think there's a lot of fear of replacement in the community, that like this stuff is going to take all of our jobs.
I'm
Um,
gonna be the first to go, and I
you,
mean that's
you think
fine.
so? Well, no, but it is interesting. I mean, we actually had this situation this week where we had like a one pager that needed to like make, like a one page website that we needed to make, and I was like, doesn't can AI just do this? And like you like literally, I just tried and copied a screenshot of a Figma file into and dropped it in ChatGPT, and it kind of did 80% of it. And you're like, okay, this is gonna. It will start whittling away a little bit at our work. It's just, and then the question is like, where do we spend our time?
Well, I was gonna, and like, and what can we learn from that? Like, I think it's more of like a different. It's like a what do you call those abstraction mirrors, like wobbly mirrors? It's kind of
Oh yeah, yeah.
it's not a mirror. It's more like that. It's
Funhouse
like
mirror.
funhouse mirror. It's like it is a distortion in a way, but I do think like getting you to that 70-80% is great because a lot of that's just work. And that's,
Yeah,
I think people take pride in the work, the labor and care that they put into like crafting something amazing. But like if you can reduce something, then I think you could, theoretically make something even more amazing because
yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah,
iterating
yeah, yeah.
faster. I think that's I think that's great.
Yeah. No, I think that's like I'm finding a lot of the designers that I really like love and respect in this space are kind of treating it that way, and they're kicking the tires on this stuff every day. But
Yeah, I
so,
think it's
oh no, go on, Miles.
coming.
What's that?
To me, I think it's not. I don't see it as a bubble. A lot of people refer to it that way, but I think it's happening either way. Like some version of
Oh
this
yeah.
is happening, and we have to figure it out and be like thoughtful with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like kind of, I mean, we've been through a couple, like if you've been around for a while, you've seen a couple of these paradigm shifts, just like even like the move from like desktop to mobile, like this is a big shift. Like it's going to change everything. So yeah, I think we have to accept it. Anyway, we are at time. Myles,
Sure.
this was like a fantastic presentation, really interesting talk. Are there any sort of anything that you'd like to sort of like sign off to the community or any kind of like words of exit and wisdom?
Oh gosh, I'm just happy to be here. I'm really grateful for so many people to show up. These were good questions. I'd love to be in touch and hear what more people think. Like I said earlier, I've been sort of privileged by the fact that people do actually engage and ask hard questions. And so I'm just, sort of welcome and open to that, and um, always looking for opportunities to do more amazing work. And
All
Josh,
right.
thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Myles, it was great having you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Feel free to join us tomorrow or next week